Welcome to this Autism Ontario webinar, promoting physical activity during adolescence and adulthood. Today, we will be joined by Patrick Jacyra, PhD. It's not his first time with us, so we're looking forward to having him back. He's the assistant professor at Durham University in the UK, an affiliate scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. So on this webinar, as I mentioned, we have Patrick, and you are all the way from the UK today. Is that correct?
I am, yes. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and great to see you again, Matt.
Nice to see you as well, Patrick. Before we get started, I got some boring stuff to cover, and that is how this whole thing works. If it's your first time joining us, right below me, there is a Q&A box. You can enter your questions there at any time throughout the presentation, and I will aspire to get those questions answered by Patrick. Beside me, you will see the slides. These will be transitioning, helping us inform our conversation and our discussion today. There's also below the slides a handouts area, and it's just jam-packed full of information that both relate to this topic, feature other Autism Ontario programs, and a list of our past webinars. We've been doing this for a while, and there's a lot of great stuff in there. If you have any issues on the webinar today, you can go ahead and click the help button, and someone will get back to you. So Patrick has put together an agenda for us today. We're going to discuss the value and benefits of physical activity. We're going to look at the rates of physical activity among autistic adolescents and adults, and discuss the barriers that limit participation, especially during this time of emerging adulthood, during the transitionary phase, which is always a challenge. Transition can be hard. So, Patrick, I don't think anyone anywhere will argue about the importance of physical activity, but this topic right now, why is it important, and why are we talking about it today?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, people know that physical activity probably has some good health benefits, whether it's physical health or mental health or just general enjoyment, satisfaction with life. But it's coming back into the forefront for two reasons. One, when we're getting out of winter, slowly but surely, we know that winters can drag on, and sometimes our rates of physical activity go down. And for those of us who don't love winter, we tend to stay inside a bit more. And secondly, we are also seeing a transition in how we're managing the pandemic. And with that, we've seen globally massive reductions in actual physical activity, especially during the first and second lockdowns. If we think back 2 years ago, and just overall, statistically, what we're seeing are lower rates of activity than pre-pandemic. So once, we are living with COVID type of approach that's happening in the world, I think it's important to bring this conversation back to the forefront, especially because some of the data that we've conducted at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health has shown that autistic people generally have actually been very adversely impacted by the pandemic. And we've also seen kind of significant decreases in physical activity, but also sleep patterns, increases in kind of an anxiety. And so for us, we're trying to find ways of, how do we then bring this back to the forefront to try and support autistic people in this new part of pandemic life, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine. I knew some of the data from our previous conversations and people we've had here on the desk, but in looking at, my life as well as, my kids, we're seeing that, we've had a lot of habits that were built during lockdown, and getting out and getting active is a change to those habits. And some of us got pretty good at living in lockdown and trying to make it exciting within the framework. And so it's about, once again, getting outside of that comfort zone. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. We want to talk about, the importance of physical activity. I think it's a great place to start there. So why don't you jump in and let us know, why is physical activity so important?
Absolutely. And I think before we start, just in regards to physical activity in pandemic life, again, it's just important to highlight that what we do discuss is obviously has to be adapted to also what is happening in the pandemic situation, right? So we know, for example, that it's still a very stressful time for many people, and especially for some autistic people, where being physically active generally before the pandemic might have been tough. We had a pandemic, and again, some of the social norms and the rules and the very, very different rates of kind of compliance to the new guidelines we're not blaming autistic people at all today for not being as physically active as they may be, but our goal is to try and find ways to actually support them better. And so to do that, I thought that we can first initially discuss, why being physically active is good. What does it do for us? What does it offer? What are some of the benefits? And also, what are some of the challenges? So generally speaking, we know that being physically active for autistic people can help with creating a sense of routine and predictability. So for some autistic people, being kind of out of a routine can be super distressing. We think about our own lives being in a routine, oftentimes, even though if it's unconscious, can help us just feel more at ease and relaxed because we know what we're going to do. So if we put that back for autistic youth and adults especially, having a sense of routine, a sense of predictability, knowing what's going to go on a given day can also just help support daily activities and just daily participation in society. We also know that being physically active provides opportunities to socialize. And this is a huge piece for many parents, especially, that we keep hearing over and over in the research. It's, why do you want your kids to be physically active? Well, we want them to hang out with other kids. We want them to have an opportunity to be with autistic kids or just other kids in general. And we know that, for example, having a sense of community where they are able to go and just be with others and feel included when it goes right, because that's not always the case. Sometimes being physically active can also lead to exclusion, and we know that. But when it does fit, we do see, honestly, huge increases in general mood and general satisfaction with life, because it provides a sense of enjoyment and a sense of fun. If physical activity wasn't fun, most people don't do it if you don't like it, right? So for those who do like it, having an outlet, having an opportunity to kind of take time out of our day to, one, just enjoy movement and actually have a sense of fun. And two, then also there's many health benefits, which we'll talk about in a second. We also know that it can have significant impacts also on mental health and maintaining kind of balance and motor skills. And these things are things we take for granted and don't think about every single day. But being physically active helps us, for example, being able to walk down the street, walk up the stairs, not fall down. And when we are physically active, all of those movement centers get kind of tested. And every single time we are active, they kind of get reinforced. It's like, okay, your body still got it. You're able to do these things. And even though it's unconscious, being physically active is important to kind of keep those movement centers and skills kind of up to snuff. Also, kind of having an opportunity for recreation. We live in a very fast-paced, intense world. And I think taking some time out of our lives, whether it's rest, repose, being physically active, if you even look at the word recreation, what goes in front of the word recreate if we see that piece, right? And so we're trying to just provide a more holistic understanding of physical activity to give people that time and space to do things that they find interesting and to really move away from and challenge this idea that to be physically active, it means you got to go to the gym 6 times a week, or you've got to be ripped and have those big muscles like they have in the movies. For me, and what we're hearing from autistic families and youth, especially when they're getting to adulthood, we just want a time and space to actually do something different. We want to kind of get away from the structures of society sometimes and the intensity of what it's like sometimes to be excluded. So by having a space and a place to be active, we're hearing time and time again, autistic people are saying, this is kind of what we want and this is what we need, but yet oftentimes it is missing. What else do we know about physical activity, generally speaking, in the population, but also for specifically autistic people? Well, we know that it can improve sleep quality. So what we've seen is a connection between higher rates of activity and increased quality of sleep. So that means longer duration of sleep. That means falling asleep earlier and sleeping through the night, and having kind of more rapid eye movement sleep, which is the deep sleep that we really need to rest. When our brain rests, when our body rests, we know, especially for those who've had kids in the room, when you're waking up every few hours to tend to a baby that's born young, and we just know how cranky we are, right? That type of tiredness makes life difficult. So by being physically active, it can improve sleep quality, and it helps us just to be able to function on a day-to-day basis. We also know that being physically active can help kind of keep a healthier weight. And we're not here to debate what is or isn't a healthier weight. That to me isn't the goal of today. What is important, though, is that we know being physically active can contribute to that. And we obviously have to be cautious to say that we don't want people using physical activity as a way to, become very fixated on a particular weight. But we do know that it can really help with just being overall healthy. We also know that it provides kind of mobility and balance. So again, these are the things that we need every single day that we take for granted, but are important to have. And by being physically active, it gives us that opportunity to keep all those things going. Strong muscles and bones, again, we don't think about them. Oftentimes, it's in older adulthood when we realize how important this is, where even a fall, for example, can lead to a hip fracture, and then hip fractures can lead to an infection, and then infection could lead to hospitalization. But physical activity can help defray that. And it's a big word to mean that it can slow down the progression of any sort of kind of muscle wasting and or bone disease, such as osteoporosis, that come with older age. Lastly, but surely not least, we have increases, especially in autistic people, in cardiovascular disease health, so better kind of heart health. We also see kind of increases in mental health, and we're going to get to that in a second.
Before we jump into mental health, I want to make sure that we answer some of our audience questions. A reminder to all those online, you can submit your questions below and we will aspire to sort of answer them. You brought up something there about going to the gym 6 times a week, and muscle bound and those ideas. Do you have an idea for, how many minutes of physical activity someone should be doing? Is there a goal that we should be aiming for?
Yeah, so in Canada, we have the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology, known as CSEP, and they've developed these master physical activity guidelines. So generally speaking, the goal is about 150 minutes a week total, so it's cumulative, and about 3 times a week is what is being suggested kind of in the literature. So in that 150 minutes, ideally, we have some activity that's low to moderate intensity, which means you're able to kind of keep a conversation going while you're talking, while you're being physically active, right? So that would be low to moderate. Vigorous would be a point in time where you can no longer have a conversation. You'd be running, or you're running at such a pace that you can't talk to your friend beside you while you're running. So that'd be vigorous intensity. But again, in our Canadian guidelines for adults suggest about 150 minutes a week, 3 times a week, and at a moderate to vigorous intensity. And the reason for that is, generally speaking, the biggest bang for your buck is when it's moderate to vigorous. So when it comes to your heart health, bang for your buck. When it comes to your mental health, bang for your buck. Generally, we're seeing that if it's moderate or vigorous, so again, being able to be just on that brink of having a conversation with someone and not losing it, that's where the biggest bang for your buck is. And if you want to try this out, this is a really cool thing called the breath sound check. If you're walking with your friend, if you're able to actually have a full-on conversation, then technically you're working at a lower intensity. If you speed up the pace of it, you'll notice it's a little harder to keep up the conversation. And the harder you go, you actually start to run out of breath and you can't actually talk. So you only can be physically active, right? So if you hit that point when you're no longer able to speak to your friend, then you're at the really high intensity piece, which is, again, one of your highest payoffs. If you're able to kind of have an easy conversation, you're in the low intensity bracket. And if it's just easy flowing and you're still able to kind of be physically active, then that's the moderate way. So that's the one way that we actually can help explain what does it mean to be intensely physically active versus moderately versus more so on the lower end of things.
We got a lot of questions about like how to get into physical activity and the like, but there's some stuff we're going to be getting to that a little bit later in the presentation, correct? Some of those. So I'm going to save those. I'm going to answer one of the questions for you, and that's somebody's asking where to get the slides for today's presentation. They're available in the handout section with a whole bunch of other helpful links to items that will assist you. And if you're a reader, you'll learn a lot more about some of the stuff that we just talked about as far as guidelines and the like go. Before I interrupted you, Patrick, you were talking about some of the linkages to mental health and the importance there. Coming out of the pandemic, I know that this is a big topic across not just the autism community, but all communities. Talk to us a little bit about how physical activity can help with those matters.
Totally. There's a huge connection, and I am very much a researcher who loves connections and is really interested in them. And before we get to the mental health one, we'll go through this motor skills one. Again, another connection where what we're seeing in the literature is that autistic children, especially who are physically active, have better social skills and have better motor skills. And the inverse is true, where autistic kids who are less physically active tend to have poor social skills and tend to have poor also motor skills. And we don't really understand the mechanism why. We don't know why that is necessarily related yet. There's a lot of work going in that area with some of my colleagues. But the point is, again, is to think about physical activity in a very holistic way, right? Again, I'm really trying to dispel these myths that you have to go and just lift weights, or you've got to go and be very intensely disciplined, because we know that even 20 minutes a day can help with things like mental health. And so what we're seeing in lab-based settings, especially for autistic people, is this real connection between physical activity and mental health. So whether it's decreases in salivary cortisol, which is the stress hormone that we have released when we're being physically active or when we're under stress, the stress hormone tends to decrease when we're active. So one idea is that when we are physically active, our body is able to kind of use the endorphins in our body, which is our feel-good hormones, to kind of boost our brain and to also get some more support. What we also see are increases in just general mood, and also just being, if you think about accomplishing a physical activity, we often tend to feel better at the end once we've been able to finish it, right? And so that's another reason why we should be physically active, because it gives us that opportunity to accomplish those goals. What we also see are increases in just general mental health, especially when combined with other mental health supports and therapies. So oftentimes people get mad at me and are like, Patrick, you're saying that they only have to do physically active and that they're going to be okay, given all the other challenges of potentially having an autism diagnosis. And I said, well, no, not necessarily. If we combine them with other things such as behavioral therapy, potentially medication, this adds another tool to the toolbox, which oftentimes hasn't been included. People have just generally medicated or just generally used behavior techniques and other psychological therapies. And so I'm saying, if we add this to our toolbox, the goal is to have another tool, not to replace anything. And what we see in the literature is that people who are both physically active and getting adequate support tend to do better. Why is this important? Why are we bringing this up? Unfortunately, in the literature, what we also see, and some of my work is focused on mental health challenges, especially in youth and adults, is the fact that we're seeing really high rates of mental health challenges and diagnoses in autistic people from childhood all the way into older adulthood. And so whether it's anxiety, whether it's depression, whether it's difficulties about thinking about ending someone's life, we do see this really high rate of that. And physical activity, as we're slowly seeing, can help somewhat slow that down. Again, we're not saying it can get rid of it or cure it, but what we are saying is that there are lower rates of, for example, challenges with anxiety or depression. And that has been seen across all different types of literature in the general population. My friend Simon Rosenbaum, who has looked at this from a schizophrenia and post-traumatic stress disorder standpoint, we see a wide range of mental health benefits across the board. Now, I sound like I am preaching the gospel, but we might ask, well, if it's so good for you, Patrick, why aren't people being active? What are the barriers? What is going on? Why are we even here talking about this? And so if we flip that, we see, again, opposite situation. Despite knowing the many benefits, what the research shows is that autistic adults and adolescents are about 60% less active, or less likely to be physically active, right? So that's almost about half of people are less likely to be active. And we're about to get a study published using some Ontario data with some Ontario youth, and we found the same thing, was that generally autistic youth are very inactive. About 20% of the 340 7 participants we had were active, right? So there's a very small minority of people, despite all those benefits. What also is problematic is that we see autistic youth and adults especially are less likely to participate in organized sports. So this one study done in the US said that it was about 74% less likely. And again, there might be a million reasons why, but we do see this systematic exclusion of autistic people from physical activity, sport participation, whether it's done in the community or whether it's done in school. And that is problematic, especially because we know the largest drop-off in the general population, especially in autistic youth, is actually during adulthood. So that point in time from between 12 and 17, 17 to 25, that's when we see the steepest drop-off in being physically active. And why does that raise many alarm bells? One, we know that especially as children and youth become adults, many mental and physical health changes are happening during that period. And if people are dropping off physical activity, we can also potentially see kind of decreases in overall health and well-being. The second piece is some troubling data as well, where we see that people who are inactive in adolescence are also probably going to be inactive in adulthood. And so what we're doing is we're missing an entire generation, an entire group of people who, generally speaking, you know, if they lack the confidence, the skills, the knowledge, or being excluded from society early on in childhood, are probably going to be also inactive in adulthood. And that has huge implications for the person, their family, and society as well. And this is not to blame autistic people, families, and caregivers at all. This is simply a call to action to say, well, we've got to do more to support people. Enough of the political speak and all the funding that has a hard time to kind of make it its way through to the ground level. More needs to be done. And, you know, once we start to think about what are some of the barriers, and again, this isn't necessarily blaming autistic people and families, because we see so many different things that are going on. And what might be some of those things? Well, lack of motivation might be one, and that's a tricky one for me. And I don't like that concept, but that's what the literature keeps showing. You know, there's some research saying that generally autistic people are not interested in physical activity, and that might be true. But for others, there's a lot of other important things. Fear of injury from parents and from autistic people themselves, and not being able to necessarily, you know, participate in very competitive settings. I've always argued maybe a competitive setting for autistic people might not be ideal. For some people, it might work great if they're autistic, and for others, it might not. So being able to provide a variety of different settings might be huge to provide motivation and also to kind of put away that fear of injury. What we also generally see are challenges with movement patterns. So again, early on in our presentation, we talked about the connection between social skills and motor skills. But also, if someone doesn't have the motor skills early on, right, we can imagine that it's this idea of use it or lose it, right? If we don't use certain things, like if you know a language that you grew up with and you don't use it anymore, you don't write with it, you don't speak, you don't write, you kind of forget it over time, right? And physical activity is the same way. Our bodies adapt to not being physically active, the same way they adapt to being physically active, right? So the more active we are, the more our bodies are, they're with it. They know what's going on. And if as soon as we slow down, we kind of see a drop off in our body saying, well, I don't have to do this anymore. Why bother? That's a lot of extra energy, right? Yeah. But if we see challenges with movement patterns from early on, perhaps we can't be surprised that autistic people aren't being active if they're not being supported early on in childhood. And one of the ways that we can support people is by providing inclusive environments. You know, I initially did a lot of my research in Toronto, and Toronto being a major urban hub still really lacked physical activity opportunities for autistic people. You know, there was one place that would routinely kick autistic kids out and youth out because they didn't have support workers. And I understood the goals of their policies, but their policies inherently are also exclusionary, right? So we have this real cacophony and a real barrier going on where we have biological challenges, social challenges, but also psychological ones. And you can see how this is all working together to really have this perfect storm of autistic people not being supported to be physically active. Some of the other kind of things,
if you don't mind, what you just said there echoes a lot of what I'm seeing in the Q&A, right? Where there's concerns of injury. But one of the things that has been coming up is this idea around just how hard it is because the social aspect generally means that you're doing your physical activity with other people, and just how hard traditional team sports are, as far as, you know, for all the reasons that you just laid out. Without there being, you know, special sort of programs and stuff, do you know of any sort of group activities that are better than others, generally speaking? Like that would be a good recommendation to families looking to do that.
Totally. So I think there's a few different ways, and I always start with trying. And unfortunately, this is the hard part. Sometimes it takes trying and failing at many things until we find what we like, both for autistic people and non-autistic people. In terms of individual sports, that's when we tend to see the biggest rate of participation is people, for example, who are doing swimming, they might be doing skating, they might be doing taekwondo. I mean, that one has been a huge one. We've seen people really do well in taekwondo, yoga, where we have this, again, mind, body, brain connection, where the focus on breathing and the focus on kind of movement can also just kind of help calm autistic children, youth, and adults down by having that kind of mind-body connection. In terms of group activities, again, this is a tough one because you have all those social cues, which sometimes might be difficult. We also have noise, right? So if we go to a gymnasium and we're playing basketball, right? One of the things I listed was sensitivity to noise and hyper or hyposensitivity to just sensory input. You know, that bouncing, that reverberation noise is really tough for some people, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really trying to figure out what works and what doesn't, and what doesn't work we probably want to stay away from. And For some people, that might be soccer. For others, that might be basketball in terms of group stuff. Again, I found sort of the individual activities, but in a collective group setting, have been more successful. So whether, again, that was the taekwondo, that was the yoga, that was the swimming, walking groups, walking families, that generally I've heard more success stories than failure stories. Yeah. Unfortunately, my research tends to hear more failure stories than success stories. And that's just because I think, honestly, as a society, we're failing autistic people, generally speaking, at all levels, including physical activity.
Yeah, I can imagine. But, you bring up something about the taekwondo. I mean, the dojo, regardless of the martial art, is generally a community. It becomes a community of sorts. And there is, that time pre and post going in and out and the different things that they do. So I can see that working, very well to be both individual and group. And yoga can be the same. A lot of those things. There's probably a long list of those types of individual yet group activities that are better suited than the team sports. And echo the whole got to try a number of things. I know with my kid, who I wanted very badly to be an athlete and turned out to be an actor, we tried a bunch. And, it wasn't until we found, that he was really wanted to be on stage that we recognized where his passion was going to be and where he was going to put it all in. But before that, it was, it was a lot of running in circles and saying, I don't want to go. So I echo that. I will jump back, everyone. I'm scanning your questions, trying to weed them in. I think some of you are seeing that, but I'll let Patrick get back to some of the barriers now.
No problem. Thanks, Matt. I think the other thing to even think about is non-traditional forms of physical activity that don't come to mind, but are super, super important. So I just had a autistic family here talk about their child taking up ballet. And again, something that we don't think about, generally speaking, as being a physical activity. It's quote unquote an alternative one from what we're normally thinking about, but this kid's loved it. And he's had an opportunity to, one, be active, two, kind of have something to participate in and feel included. And also three, like Matt said, to have that social piece during the activity, following the activity. And, the family told me when they went away on a holiday that apparently the kids were asking for the kid when he was away. And so you can see a real sense of community that can be built. And when it works well, when, there's this idea of having the person environment fit. So when the person fits the right environment, whether it's physical activity, whether it's just overall society, that's when we thrive, right? When we're in the wrong space, especially spaces that are difficult for us mentally or physically or emotionally, that's when we tend to do poorly. So, again, there's no recipe for success in finding the right physical activity. But what we do generally say is, unfortunately, you're going to have to try and not to force it. And I know as much as we want to try and force our kids to be active, and sometimes, might be a few incentives that have to kind of be utilized. But at the same time, we want there to be some sort of intrinsic drive. From what the research shows us generally in the physical activity research is that if we use extrinsic motivators, such as an iPad, that works for some point in time, but then that fades. If it's money, it tends to fade. So if we can find this connection to being intrinsically motivating in some way, shape, or form, that'd be great. There's another youth who I met who intrinsically is motivated because he has a huge passion here in the UK for finding trails. And so his parents were able to just kind of haphazardly, just by luck, by guessing, they got him a trail map. And every single weekend, if the weather's okay, they go on a new hike. And again, of course, there's many things that come into that. One, having access. Two, having the financial means. And we fully understand that. But having that connection to the physical activity plus a special interest, aka the trails, that has been huge to kind of get him out there. And before that, parents said that they had a real hard time kind of getting him out there. And so, again, just finding these unique ways that oftentimes aren't typical, that oftentimes aren't what we conceptualize to be physical activity, to kind of get the ball rolling. To kind of keep the ball rolling, I was also going to kind of just mention again, what are some of the barriers, especially in Ontario, even around the world, and I'm seeing the same issues here since I moved to the UK. There's an overall lack of opportunities, resources, financial kind of constraints. There also is this massive gap in competing priorities. And I get it when parents are like, our kid is just trying to finish high school and there's enough stress, or we're just trying to get him into the next goal of adulthood in this point in time from, youth years to adulthood, of whether it's going into post-secondary, whether it's working, whether it's kind of being on assisted living. There's so many priorities that make it hard. And I fully sympathize and don't blame people at all if they can't make it work. But at the same time, we have to kind of find ways to support people, because that's our goal ultimately. It should be to try and, if we do take care of people, then we can really support them in many different ways. And again, one of the time constraints being a huge issue, especially in pandemic life, where we can have back-to-back meetings if we're at work or at school. And if we don't put that movement time in, it doesn't happen, right? And so again, it's important to, if we can, build it into our days, whether it's with autistic people or just for those that are online, just to have that kind of time and space and place to move our bodies. Because I would always argue we've been designed to move, for those of us who can move, obviously without certain limitations. I mean, there's a reason why humans can run sometimes a marathon and more. And I think, again, finding ways that bring us joy, passion, kind of sensation, connection to society are key things that will, I argue, help people be physically active, rather than just focusing on, their step count, which could be helpful, but for other people, not so much.
You brought up the trail guide and the like. I'm wondering if have you seen any experience in connecting sort of the computer or the online world, which we know a lot of people in the community will gravitate towards, and activities. So whether it be scavenger hunts or activities that have an online social group, even though you're out there and doing it individually. Have you seen this come up at all in your practice?
So there hasn't been a whole lot of research into that area, but anecdotally from what we've heard, if you guys remember Pokemon Go, do you remember when that was a thing and everyone was all about it? I mean, ideas like Pokemon Go were incredible, right? And in the autistic community, especially just talking to families anecdotally, like they were shocked. Like they're the ones who had to drag their kids home because they're like, it's time to go home, because it was obviously, for better or worse, very addicting to try and keep playing Pokemon Go. But that connection, whether it's an online resource with an online community or an online goal setting type of related activity, I mean, that is what tends to bring people back over and over and over again. And the more we try and force it because we have to do it versus because we want to do it, I mean, that's when we see the biggest drop off, is when people have to do it. And I keep saying, so, if we find ways, whether it's online tools, whether it's Pokemon Go, whether it's kind of that intrinsic motivation to want to be active, that's what brings people back time and time and time again. If you guys can imagine, for those of us who are on the call, and if we're parents in this group, if you are forced to run a marathon, which is no fun for anyone, 99% of people probably in this group are going to be like, no, it's not happening, right? And the same idea applies to autistic youth and adults, especially as they're transitioning into that kind of emerging adulthood years, where we want to provide ways and mechanisms and areas of interest that will kind of get them to kind of buy in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, we all know the story in Canada here of the kids who dad wanted them to play in the NHL and did everything when they were young and they were a great player, and quit when they were 13, while the rest of us were still loving and enjoying it, right? Like, it has to be, for all of us, it has to be our own self-motivation. There's a number of questions that I just want to handle real quick, Patrick, about, where people can, I know that there's not a lot of opportunities for sort of integrated experiences, whether it be children or adults, but if there are in your region, the Autism Ontario Service Navigator is the person to reach out to. So if you can reach out to them, they will give you some tidbits on different programs. They know about, I'm not gonna say all, but pretty much everything that's going on in the province. They should be able to help you. And then for adults, we're going to be putting up the contact for the adult services group as well, just so that you guys can see where it is you need to go. But if you take nothing from this, if you're looking for opportunities, contact Autism Ontario, and they will be able to they'll be able to direct you as to what is available in your area.
Thanks, Matt. And I think over and over again, there's this huge study that was just published a few weeks ago. It was in the general population that said, why do people come back? And people keep saying it's the social component. That was the number one reason. And it almost seems very obvious, but at the same time, it's almost like we need a reminder. And when the pandemic first started, we ran this program for youth and adults with neurodevelopmental disorders. So autism, ADHD, OCD, and it was online. And we had people from the US, we had people from Finland, we had people all across Canada. And the number one thing that made it hard to end that program due to a number of different reasons and constraints was that people were like, I'm going to miss my friends next week. And it gave them that hour. And, you know, we did really, like if you break that down, we did 25 minutes of movement, about 5 minutes of like, you know, you kind of give some time to introduce and whatnot. And 30 minutes was social. And that social piece really drove that group. And we started with 4 people. We ended up with over 40. And again, that social link, whether it's online or in person or finding that connection with that family member or caregiver or friend or whoever, that social link really seems to be driving that main piece of being physically active. All right, so how do we then keep people physically active? What can we do about it? And so before we get there, you know, I did include a slide on stand up and stretch. I am standing. So for those of us who are in our chairs, and if you want to stand up and stretch, if you want a nerd fact, generally speaking, the fact is we should be adjusting our posture about every 20 minutes. So whether you stand even for a minute, it's good just to get our spine to kind of realign and not be sitting for hours at a time, because that's when we tend to see neck issues and back issues. And you might have heard of this new term called text neck, because we're always down on our phones. So again, for those of us who are sitting, highly encourage you to stand up and stretch. And I've included a sample stretch, one of my favorites for your low back, but also your entire mid-region and arms, as shown in that photo. If you want to kind of mimic that, feel free to go for it. So, you know, we've talked about the barriers, we've talked about what can we do and what are the benefits. Now, how do we get there? What is the vehicle map? Do we need some guidance is one of the questions. And here in the UK, I've been really lucky to be involved with this group at Durham University, which is where I work, in which we developed a infographic for disabled children and young people. So this infographic was entirely co-produced with disabled children. So even though we're talking about autistic youth and young adults today, this relates because my job was to actually communicate with the autistic youth, adults, caregivers, stakeholders, etc. And that was used to develop this infographic, you know, in conjunction with youth and adults with visual impairments, cerebral palsy. You can imagine we had a huge group. Point is, what do they say that came back over and over and over again? We had this idea that we thought was brilliant as researchers. We called it exercise snacks, where you can snack on physical activity, be active for, you know, 5 minutes at a time. Well, guess what? When we actually asked the youth and the adults, they're like, this idea is silly. We don't get it. And don't include that in our infographic because no one's going to get it. And so if you zoom in, you can see, again, what are some of the aspects that they highlighted. Again, you see this kind of focus on equity and making sure that people have equal opportunity to actually participate, because we know there's a huge issue in disabled children and young people where their opportunities are not there. We see also, again, a sense of fun. We see a sense of movement or overall sense of participation. That is what is driving physical activity. And that's what the young people told us. And then we kind of cross-referenced that with the research evidence. And we found the same thing, is that what the young people told us also was mirrored in the research. And so this infographic is free to use, developed. We were asked by the UK Chief Medical Officers of Health to commission this work. So this is free to use. Feel free to share this with anyone, anywhere, anytime. If they're asking for a resource, okay, like how do I get someone and they don't know, what are some of the benefits? Boom, there it is for you. When we evaluated the evidence and we said, okay, well, what's the best for disabled children, youth, and young adults in terms of time and how many minutes they need? Is it an hour? Is it 20? Is it 10? We found 20 minutes offered the most bang for your buck in terms of health benefits, enjoyment, and overall. So for only 20 minutes a day, and I sound like a salesperson, you know, by being physically active for only 20 minutes in disabled youth and young people, we can start to see a huge payoff in overall, again, physical health, mental health, and just overall participation in society, which we know can be a huge challenge in autistic people, where time and time again, we hear stories of them being excluded. So that guideline was just published in 2022 in February. This one that I'm showing here is for disabled adults and older adults, and that was done in 2017. Same idea, chief medical officers in the UK asked the same research group here, what is the evidence? How can we make it happen? And again, they co-produced and worked with disabled adults, wide range, to figure out what can we do and what are the benefits. And again, overall, we see, you know, similar messages as what the children and the youth said in terms of making a daily habit, trying to have an opportunity to, you know, have some independence. And that, of course, might not be possible for all autistic people. And sometimes they might all need support, and that's okay. But time and time again, autistic youth and adults, you will see, keep saying that this is important. they are hungry for this. They want opportunities. They're looking for opportunities. And for the parents in the group, I think that might be something similar. It might be similar sentiments. Like, you want to engage, but you have nowhere to turn to. And that is a huge barrier across, the UK that I've seen, and both in Canada, where I've spent a lot of my time doing this research. And so, again, another resource to share, but also to kind of remind us of why being physically active is important. What can it offer, and what can we do about it is where we're going to go next. So, similar to one of the themes that I talked about earlier today about dispelling these myths that we have to be in the gym 8 times a week, that we have to be there for hours upon a time, one of the things that I think we need to do is reimagine what does it mean to be physically active, and to really let go of that idea that it has to be sport, that it has to be fitness. I mean, there's so many different options. There's so many cultural components to it. Cultural dance is a physical activity that oftentimes doesn't get a lot of attention, but it's so important as a way to kind of get people in through the door. A lot of times people ask me, Patrick, what would you recommend? How can I get my kid and or my young adult to engage? And I say, well, here's a brief list that I've kind of put together for us today. And the first thing is to think about, even as household chores, such as cleaning and vacuum as activity. If we can kind of make that fun and reimagine, especially as a starting point, especially if we have a challenge getting someone to be physically active and they're starting at level 0 with nothing, this might be stage 1, right? If someone doesn't do very much to begin with, and if we put them all the way into a very vigorous activity, which they likely will not like, they're not going to go back. So if we can find that optimal zone of proximal development, which is that perfect spot in which it's not too hard and it's not too easy, people are more likely to engage. Walking, running, gardening, strength training and weights, skipping rope, all examples of how to be physically active. And again, this might have a lot of different components that can go to it, different levels of support for different people, but all kinds of very valid, very important activities that can be used. And again, not only sport. For those of us who want to do sport, all the power to you. Nothing wrong with sport. But I'm providing some alternatives to think about of what can we do. Some other activities that we talked about earlier with Matt: yoga, boxing, taekwondo, kind of martial arts, judo. There's a lot of the martial arts in particular keep coming back to me as something that is of real particular interest, that has worked very well for many families who keep seeing it over and over and over again. Again, it's hard to find an environment that supports autistic people with that, but there are a few of them in the GTA especially that actually have coaches. I know there was one at Yonge and Eglinton in Toronto that specifically welcomes autistic youth and adults to actually participate, because we know the benefits. We know that it's helpful, but yet we have to find ways to be more supportive and find opportunities. Swimming, for some people, as you can imagine, it's a love or hate. I don't love swimming. I love just paddling in water. But for some of our artistic youth and adults, they adore it. It's just this connection between the water, their hair being wet, the movement. Some people just are very drawn to it. And if that's what they enjoy, then that's something that we could potentially encourage. Of course, there's drowning risks. And we also know that for some autistic people, drowning is a very real risk. And so I'm not saying that everyone has to go out and swim without swimming lessons or without having that support. But again, if we reimagine what it means to be physically active, it's not just sport. It could include swimming, which of course is also a sport. Other activities, riding a stationary bike or a moving bike, again, might be a very good way to get someone going. To me, a stationary bike is better than a treadmill, only because it's a little safer. A treadmill, especially when someone's running on it with speed, can be a bit dangerous. A stationary bike is a lot safer, which is why I included there over a treadmill. But again, if someone wants to kind of go into the running mode, all the power to them to try, at least try that activity. If they don't like it, they don't like it. Dancing to music. One thing that we found out over and over and over again in that Fit Friday program during the pandemic, we offered a wide range of activities. Dancing to music was like the #1 hit. And we're like, well, we're going to plan the perfect event. We're going to have the best warm-up and the best cool down, and it's going to be fitness. And it's like, no, we don't care really as much about the fitness pieces as the dance. And that's really what got people to come back every week. And so again, an activity that can be done is dancing to music, and even just putting it on your own home and dance like no one's watching. I mean, there's a reason that exists. And to encourage that creativity and playfulness, even in youth and adults, dancing when no one's watching can be an option. Horseback riding, another activity, especially we're seeing some therapeutic benefit as well. Very little research on that so far, but there is some benefit to say that, engaging in horseback riding can be both therapeutic, but also is physically active. As you can imagine, that movement, riding, bouncing up and down, staying balanced, that is all using our muscles and our core muscles that are oftentimes not engaged in our daily lives. So totally a valid activity, totally worth it for those of us. Again, it is an expensive one, but for those who do have access, it can be something. Climbing stairs, this is much loved and hated, but again, another way to kind of be physically active. Instead of taking the elevator, if you don't have to, try and take one flight of stairs a day. Those little adjustments that can make a huge difference. Bowling is another kind of activity that, again, not traditionally thought to be physical activity, but can have a huge social component, can really be fun, and especially in the experience that I have working with youth and young adults with autism, it's a huge hit, bowling. It's like one of those things that time and time again, if there's one activity that I can take them out, the Jays game is fun for 5 minutes. That didn't work so well in the program that I ran in Toronto. It was more fun for me than the adults. Bowling was a huge hit over and over and over again. So that's why I kind of included it in this list.
Before we get into the strategies, which I know we're going to have a lot of questions, and I want to give you a lot of time on that, we do have a question around transitioning from one activity to another and some of the challenges that go with that change. When I look at some of your lists, I see household chores, dancing when nobody is looking, which again is something that would commonly happen in the living room, or the like, walking, which could be done, with one friend or a family member. But taking dancing while no one's watching and thinking about going into a dojo to do taekwondo or kickboxing, there's a drastic change there that we know. But in general, as a people, if we're used to one thing and doing one thing, do you have any recommendations for looking to change the activity, whether it be stepping up from one to another or just, alternating to a different setting?
Absolutely. So I think there's a few different things that we can do. The first, and I've done this, especially when it comes to swimming and surfing. I have a friend who does surfing in Vancouver. She's got the best lifestyle. She's a surfer and works with autistic youth and adults. And one of the things that they do actually is they've now developed a video with the autistic youth and adults that actually just gives them an introduction. Like, this is surfing. This is where you're going to come. When you do get here, this is what's going to happen. This is the equipment you're going to put on. Especially putting on a wetsuit or dry suit might not be a great experience for some people. But even just talking through it, showing what that wetsuit looks like, showing exactly the location, where that surfboard is going to be, where your instructors are going to be, where they're going to be in the water. Having that kind of time to get someone ready. And you would want to show that video, a few days ahead or a few weeks ahead even, to kind of prompt and prime, our autistic youth and adults to be kind of ready on know what to expect. Because as we can imagine, going to a new place can be very anxiety provoking, especially for those of us on the spectrum. So having that sort of transition piece that, includes some sort of visuals or a video, to me has been a huge recipe for success, than just kind of showing up with someone, with kind of unannounced without a plan in place. So that would be the first thing. The second thing would also be, if you're participating in a community-based activity, to also, if you can, and I always hate asking parents because you guys are so busy, but if you can reach out to the organization ahead of time and say, well, these are what some of the needs are. This is kind of what to expect. Can you give us a rundown of what's going to happen on day one so that I can also share with my child, or can you meet with us ahead of time? And even going there physically in person might be one way to help deal with some of that anxiety. Again, these are small tips and tricks that I know they seem very kind of innocuous and silly, but at the end of the day, if they work and if they help someone participate, then I'm all for stuff like that.
Excellent. So I'm going to give you sorry. I'm going to just 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to back out and let you roll through the strategies. Apologies, Patrick. And I won't interrupt again until we get to the end, and then I'll come in with our final questions.
Fantastic. Well, I started with a bit of those strategies and we'll continue to roll with them. So as I talked about, delivery of instructions, there it is. Being able to provide clear, concise, and direct instructions. There's this idea that we call the rule of 3. We don't want to give more than 3 instructions at a time. As we know, we tend to forget them. They're overwhelming. We lose track. So if our instruction is, go to the gym, meet instructor, and sit down, that's all we need at a time. Whether it's the parent delivering that, whether it's the teacher or coach, we want to keep them concise, to the point, and clear without much space for ambiguity. We want to make sure that they make sense. Self-monitoring could be another thing to use, where again, we kind of ask participants to give feedback of what, what works for them, what doesn't work for them, how can we support them better, and providing that idea. Cueing is another strategy that we can use where, again, we want to give them idea of, okay, well, so I just asked you to sit down in the gym. Next, what we have is X, Y, and Z. So next, you're going to stand up and go, play this ball game. And then we explain the ball game, using that cue to get them ready rather than just throwing them into the mix. It has a huge impact on general participation, enjoyment, satisfaction, again, and trying to decrease that anxiety of being in a new place, in a new setting with new people, because we know it can be scary. Reinforcements might be another way. One thing that we keep hearing is, the use of iPads, and people are like, you support it, do you not? I say if it supports the physical activity and if it still can have a healthy relationship, or for example, if the iPad could be removed at any time for whatever reason, then that's totally okay. Generally speaking, we argue not to use food as a reinforcement if possible, just because we don't want to create a bizarre relationship with food and eating, because we need it to obviously survive. But if that's what works, that's the only option, then of course, support what parents go through. What are some of the other things that we can do? And I know it sounds trivial, but it's important to try and do it with a friend, do it with a colleague, or if there's no one to do it with, to try and do it on your own. And even if you can kind of build it into your day, whether it's 5 minutes, whether it's 10 minutes at a particular day and time. And as I was saying, if 12 o'clock is your movement time, and block that out, whether it's performing that for someone who's an autistic adult or a youth, and just making sure that gets included, so be it. Obviously, we want to have some flexibility and not be rigid, because sometimes being rigid can be stressful. But overall, if we can make it a structured event, something to look forward to, something that provides some kind of structure and predictability, oftentimes it works pretty well. Some of the things that work well, doing it as a family, there's a huge bonus for those of us who are fortunate to have a lot of others around us, by having a mother or a father or parents who are physically active. It's huge bonus to kind of everyone active, because the benefits cut across all people. So doing it as a group, doing it as a wider collective, huge rapport. Additional strategies that we can use, build rapport. And I know this sounds a bit silly, but if you can spend the time to figure out what that special interest is, just like that example of the map, had they not figured out that the map is something that uses some real interest, that has been a huge success for them. And that was just kind of haphazard and happened accidentally. But by building that and taking time to actually figure out what those interests are, could be huge. We also, we talk about the rule of 3, again, providing short and concise instructions. Front-loading activities is the big word for what we describe in terms of providing a written or a video-based summary of what sort of activities will happen on that day and during each event. Reward system we talked about, and individualize. The thing is, we want to find a way to have that perfect balance between not being too hard and not being too easy. This is kind of what I call the inverted U theory, where if we're in the middle of the U, we're more likely to be successful. If we're on the either side, on the low side or on the high side of the U, on either polar opposite, we're probably going to fail. So if we can find that optimal zone that allows people to be physically active, that is most likely what's going to keep bringing them back through the door time and time again. Other tips and tricks, finding a time in the day, again, like we talked about, 10, 15-minute walk, that's all it takes. Try and build into our schedule at any point in time. Other things that I've talked about here before is, even if you're using the washroom or you're getting up from your desk, try and just even do squat, push-up, jumping jack, moving your arms, stretching. Even that could be something so simple to start. And something that's all it takes. Some people might find it beneficial to use an alarm, such as, okay, for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to set 15-minute alarm. I'm going to work out during this time. That's my workout time. Boom, it's done. It's out of my brain. And we move on. And for some people that works, and that's great. For others, it doesn't. But again, it just goes back down to finding what works for you. Setting a goal, making it fun. Try and find ways to make it fun time and time again is what seems to bring people back through the door over and over. I wanted to finish off with 2 pieces on advocacy. Again, like Matt talked about, the point of emerging adulthood is a tricky time for everyone. What we see in Ontario especially is this huge failure, honestly, of pathways between health, education, social institutions that aren't coordinated, that they're not communicating. And people are passed on from one thing to another, to another, to another, and there's no end in sight. And so, one of the things that we have to keep doing is advocating and saying, well, enough of this kind of just handing over, which is exhausting and tiring and gets nothing done for anyone. We need to almost in a way restructure these pathways because they're not working for us. And that does take advocacy, and there's some people listening at the table, but not enough. And so I'm hoping that for those of us who are here, maybe we could take this forward. Another thing to take forward is to talk about funding for physical activity and making it a priority. Instead of just saying that, something that everyone has to do for their own health, if we provide funding supports for a support worker or for parents or for someone else who couldn't attend or for programs, that might be a way to get people through the door and support physical activity. Because, as much as the politicians might say it's going to cost us money, well, I hate to say it's going to cost you one way or another. You either support the physical activity now, or there's a chance we're going to be paying for their healthcare down the line anyway. So if we can find ways to provide pathways and provide financial supports to people, that'd be the ideal way to have pathways that support activity. Last, certainly but not least, I always say some activity is better than none. If we can take that with us as a takeaway message today, if there's one thing, take that. It's that if we're physically active, even if it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes today, that is better than zero. And if we can build up to as much or as little as you want to do, that'd be ideal. And I encourage people to try and always do some as a place to kind of get started. One of the most important learnings I've had in this work is I've actually had youth just ask me to tell adults, especially in those who are supporting roles, to ask them and say, are you ready today? Just because we have something scheduled in the calendar that says we're doing Taekwondo Tuesday at noon, may we just ask them, say, do you feel ready today? Do you feel okay? Does your body feel okay? And if the answer is no, then we take that and we evaluate, do we participate? But again, putting people in that context when they have the power and the autonomy to actually make those decisions has been a huge help to actually get them to be physically active. Last thing, trying activities. And I know this kind of is really exhausting because there's no one right thing that works, but to try different activities, in person, virtual, experiment, Pokemon Go, maps, what have you, the more you can try different things at different times, the more we have an increased chance of being successful in conjunction with all this advocacy that is needed. And yeah, thanks so much, Matt, and everyone for inviting me. And I hope we have a few minutes for questions.
We do. I think we could probably take a couple questions. So everyone is really looking for, I would say in general, and I've asked the questions, but as I scroll through, I keep seeing the same things, like the best, which I think we tackled, the best places to start, especially within sort of group activity. I then a lot about transitioning from one to another. But for those who are on here supporting someone else, as far as the family goes, how important is it that the entire family is committed to physical activity in order to make this kind of thing work?
I mean, it adds a huge layer, right? So commitment is nice, but we can't necessarily, again, if 3 of the 5 of us are active and if the 2 aren't, then do we do it all together? Do we gonna get upset at them? What we're seeing is that if we can have active families overall, that tends to increase the levels of activity for everyone. And so what we see in research, both in autistic and non-autistic groups, is parents who are physically active are more likely to also have their kids participate in physical activity at the same time. So I always keep arguing, you got to do more to support the parents. Parents are burnt out, they are burdened, they are overwhelmed with navigating services in Ontario. It's a disaster sometimes. But if we can find that time as a group to participate, 1, there's benefits for the adults, but 2, there's also there's benefits for the youth and the young adults as well. So, I really say if we can have the biggest bang for our buck is to get people active as a group, whether it's within a single family home or a multi-family home. But that to me has always been kind of a big feature that has been missing, because the benefits are great. And again, I totally sympathize and understand how exhausting it is, especially after the end of a long work day, let alone a pandemic. I mean, the pandemic hasn't helped anyone's cause. So if we can find a way to do it, fully supportive. At the same time, we also have to kind of recognize all these other factors that are playing into being physically active or not.
Right. All right. Well, with that, we've reached the end of our time. I want to reiterate a few things that were said, and that is this presentation can be found in the handout section, so you can go there and download that. The other things that we provided in the handout section should help answer some of the more technical questions that people have been asking about the amount of time, what constitutes physical activity. I think that in all of the documentation, Patrick's definition was probably the best and the most easy to consume, but it is all there. And as you continue to go on your journey and search for supports or integrated programs or programs in general, always use your service navigator at Autism Ontario or the team at Autism Ontario, who are there to help and will be able to assist you. With that, I should let everyone know that this event will be recorded, archived, and available on demand tomorrow on the Autism Ontario website. If you know anybody who you think would have benefited from this but wasn't able to attend, please pass this along, share it with friends, family, and loved ones. The more people that come through this program, the more of these events that we're able to do. So with that being said, Patrick, thanks so much for your time. Enjoy the UK.
Thank you so much, Brad. Great to see you, and thank you everyone for joining. And I hope we can find some physical activity in the summer months as spring comes into play.
Nice. And as Autism Ontario, for myself, I'd like to thank you, and we'll see you next time at our next Autism Ontario event.